This conference will now be recorded.
And I'm going to start the program.
Great. So I have notes that I've made here. So if it looks and sounds like I'm reading, I probably am. But the first thing I'd like to do is to thank you, Amy and Lori, for the honor and the privilege of the invitation to make this presentation. And as Amy had mentioned earlier, we're all friends. This is informal. Just wave your hands if there's anything you want me to stop and go back to. Just don't worry, it's fine. So just feel free to jump in and stop me, to ask a question, ask for clarification, whatever. And then I'll address any questions that you have as we go along. So feel free to do that. Let's see here. What I'm talking about is not meant to be all-inclusive, covering everything. So I will be speaking in generalities, and I do try to keep things not too technical. I like to keep things grounded and real, because it's easy to become overly technical talking about art history. So I'm going to try to keep it as general and grounded as I can. But again, if you want any clarification, just go ahead and ask. So Amy, if you want to go ahead and put up the first slide. So this is by William Keith, and this is 1875. So in the evolution of painting here in California, which essentially mirrors what was going on everywhere else, except that we were kind of lagging behind. We're kind of the last on the timeline. It begins in Europe, then it migrates here to the East Coast, and then maybe to Chicago, and then eventually it makes its way here, all the different movements. But generally speaking, in the mid to late 1800s, the prevailing painting style in California and elsewhere was characterized by realism and a color palette that was true to nature, and it tended to be on the darker side. The artists were generally painting what they saw and being as faithful as they could in their renderings or their transcriptions of what they were seeing. And it was more about skill of being able to transcribe what was in front of them than it was about having a creative or visionary imagination. And again, there's always exceptions to this general rule, but that's sort of where we start here. So Amy, if you want to go to the next slide, please. So this is about 30 years later, and this is the same artist. This is William Keith. So the first slide was 1875. This is 1908. Next slide, please. So this is Granville Redmond, and this is 1910. So by this time, the influence of French Impressionism starts to show up here in California. The forms are less photographic, and the artists began using a brighter, lighter color palette. Now, with Redmond, you see that he's still being faithful to nature, and he really isn't taking any liberties with color. You know, he's not, in other words, he probably wasn't aware of or influenced by any of the emerging trends from Europe at that point, or even here. He's still being true to nature, and what you see here is probably pretty close to what he actually saw himself. He isn't taking any artistic liberties. Okay, so next slide, please. So this is Guy Rose, and this was painted in Giverny in 1910. Next slide, please. So this is Guy Rose, and this is The Green Mirror. It's 1911. And you see here that the figure, and during this period, especially in California, in circa 1910 through the teens, the human figure is usually depicted in a formal or a semi-formal setting. The next slide. So this is also Guy Rose, and this is San Gabriel in 1914. So Guy Rose was originally from Los Angeles, and he's significant because he provides the formal and direct link between French Impressionism and American and California Impressionism. He traveled to France, where he lived in Giverny, and he became friends with Monet. And this was for quite a number of years before he eventually returned here to Los Angeles. So Guy Rose is the direct link between French Impressionism and American and or California Impressionism. Next slide, please, Amy. So this is, we would pronounce Jean Mannheim, but I believe his pronunciation was French or Germanic, Jean Mannheim. He was originally from Germany, but like a number of artists that emigrated here from Europe, he studied there and then came here really to begin his professional career in earnest. So this is Sierra Madre, and this is 1910. Next slide, please. This is also Jean Mannheim, and this is the wonderful domestic scene painted in his home. And this is Ironing Day, and this is 1912. So as we move forward into the 20s, this artist, Jean Mannheim, and Joseph Kleich, they were among the few California artists of note who regularly incorporated informal figures into their compositions, depicting the activities of daily life. So aside from what you're seeing here, Jean Mannheim, some of the other painters, made money from doing formal portrait commissions. But those type of pictures are very formal. There's really nothing going on in the background. It's about the sitter. It's about presenting the dignified aspects of the sitter. Most of those patrons that commissioned those works were well-to-do. But when you see something like this is uncommon for the period in California art, because most of the artists were painting pure landscapes. And if they weren't doing pure landscapes, they were doing formal portraiture. So once you start to see figures like this, we call them genre scenes, depicting daily activities. This is something that begins to happen, but at no point was it being done on a large scale for some reason, which is unusual, because in the East and in Europe, these type of pictures in that period of time were very common. But for some reason that I've never been able to figure out, I don't know that anybody has, this type of composition was never as popular here in California during that period of time. Okay, Amy, please, next slide. Oh, next slide. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is Joseph Kleich. So continuing on regarding portraiture. So this is 1910. So you see how the the background is dark. The figure and everything else is painted quite realistically. He's pretty much painting what he saw. And he's not really taking any liberties here. This is pretty much a straightforward transcription of what he was seeing. Next slide, please. So here we are 12 years later. This is Joseph Kleich. This is 1922. So the portrait we just saw was 1910. This is 12 years later, 1922 in Laguna Beach. So he came here from Chicago about 1920. So 1922, you see how drastically he's evolved. It's an entirely different creature, really. You see a lot of light, you see a lot of color. It's representational. We know what we're seeing. A tree is a tree, and so on and so forth. You have the dog. But this definitely shows the influence of Impressionism. See, there's a dog in the lower right down below and this is really one of the great icons of early California art. This painting is really a magnificent snapshot of a moment in time. And Kleich himself realized this. He understood, he during his own lifetime, he understood that he'd made pictures that had very quickly become historical documents because Laguna was undergoing such rapid development at the time. Kleich left for about a year and a half, and when he came back, he couldn't recognize the town, and he realized, oh, all these paintings that I did just a couple of years ago are historic documents. So this painting was donated to the city, and it's one of their prized possessions at this point. Next slide, Amy, please. So this is the same year. It's Joseph Kleich. This is 1922. So you can see now he's really just exploding the color. He's not, if you think about the first portrait we saw in 1910, this is a difference of night and day. I mean, he's really, really, he's pulling out all the stops. This is probably one of the most colorful pictures, not only by Kleich, but from the entire period amongst all the painters working in California. This is a really notable example for its color. Okay, next slide, Amy, please. So Kleich's favorite, this is also Joseph Kleich, 1923, his favorite place to paint was San Juan Capistrano. And if you look into Joseph Kleich's work, you'll see that he painted more images of the mission in Capistrano than any other subject. However, this picture is showing you the rural outskirts of Capistrano. So the mission would actually be behind you, and this is slightly east, and just about where you see the water running through the middle of the picture, that's probably where the 5 freeway is today. And what's really, I think, notable about this picture is Kleich was truly a plein air painter. He worked outside, he worked on location, and you can tell that in some of the pictures, he's working very rapidly. He's really working feverishly, and he's trying to capture the fleeting moment. But if you see all the little daubs of paint on all the branches, this is a very, very exceptional picture by Kleich because it's so fresh, and you can tell that he's inspired by what he's seeing, by what he's feeling, and he's trying to capture it all right there in the moment before it's gone. Okay, next slide, please, Amy. This is also Joseph Kleich, and this is going to be 1928. So around 1926, 27, Kleich goes to Europe for about a year and a half, goes to Spain, goes to France, goes to England. When he comes back, as I mentioned earlier, he has the realization that the pictures he painted before he left have become historical documents. So that inspires him to go out and continue painting the town of Laguna as it's changing, as it's transforming. So what you're looking at here is downtown Laguna, and the ocean is just to the right of the houses. It's just behind those houses. Those houses would all have frontage on the beach looking at the ocean. And if you look straight down the street at about 12 o'clock, you see that outcropping. That is where I believe it's either where the museum is today or where the Hotel Laguna is. It's one of the two. So everything you see on the right, all those structures are gone. None of that exists today. And that bluff that's bare, it's all built up. So this picture very quickly became a historical document, a snapshot of a moment in time, and everything that you see here is gone or changed radically in this painting. Okay, Amy, next slide, please. So after Kleich comes back from Europe, you notice that this painting in particular, there's a kind of maybe not immediately so definable sense of modernism or modernity here that you don't see in his earlier work prior to his trip to Europe. 23, 24, 25 doesn't look like this. This is very modern. This is 1930. So you see that there's, if you look at the forms, look at the trees, look at the figures, there's a little bit of modernism here. And we think that that's because of his trip to Europe. He would have seen all of the latest modern trends, especially in Spain, like at the Prado, in France, in England. He would have seen the very latest emerging European trends in modernism. So even though he's painting Laguna, he's still painting Laguna, what you see overall here stylistically has a sense of modern flair that's new, it's newly arriving in the way he's working. His earlier work prior to Europe doesn't look like this. Okay, Amy, next image, please. Okay, so this is William Wendt, and we're kind of going back in time because we're doing chronologically per artist. So this is William Wendt, and this is actually I think it's a very modern picture for its day. This is 1916, and that's Pacific Coast Highway. That's what it looked like at the time. So that's Pacific Coast Highway looking north in Laguna Beach, and that's 1916. Okay, next slide. Okay. So here is the landscape with Lupin, and this is quite typical for Wendt, although Wendt was really never one to use a lot of color. So this is 1921. So the last picture of Coast Highway is 1916. This is 1921. Generally, you could refer to the bulk of Wendt's output as a symphony in green. That's really, he loved green. He loved every hue of green. And a lot of pictures are essentially symphonies in green. But this is notable because of the Lupin. Again, this is 1921. Next slide, Amy, please. So this is very, very modern for Wendt. This is 1927. So it's not only very forward-looking stylistically, but in many ways it's timeless because it could have been painted really any time between the 1940s or 50s and today. And there are elements of this painting that even are reminiscent of what they call the Bay, we're going to get to later, the Bay Area figurative painters who emerged in the 1950s and 60s. So with Wendt, we see clearly a very noticeable evolution towards, again, a relative modernism that shows up mainly in his forms. You see how a lot of the forms have a blocked kind of construction. Although his palette does become bolder as we move further along in time, his palette does become bolder and brighter and more saturated, but only in select works. This is a very notable picture for him. There are not many pictures he painted that look like this. Okay, Amy, thank you. Next slide, please. So now as we move into the 1930s, we see the rise of regionalism with artists from around the country, including here in California, who were painting the American scene and with an eye towards social realism. So two prime examples of this kind of regional painting would be this first view of downtown Los Angeles. This is by Phil Dyke. This is in the 1930s. Next slide, please, Amy. And this is Millard Sheets. And this is painted from the top of Bunker Hill. And you're looking south, slightly north, but south. And it's interesting because the painting is titled Angel's Flight. And I'm sure most of us are familiar with Angel's Flight. That's the tiny funicular, they call it the world's smallest railroad or rail line, but the tiny funicular in downtown LA that's still there, that will take you from the top of Bunker Hill, where they're standing, down below, like one block below. But it's interesting that Sheets titled this Angel's Flight, but he doesn't include Angel's Flight itself in the composition. But this is a classic example of the American scene. Really, we would call it the California scene, the school of regionalism that becomes popular. You really see this emerging in the 30s. And so the 30s and the 40s, this was really the prevailing, more of a mainstream trend that replaced or supplanted plein air landscape painting. If you look at exhibition notices from that period and you look at them regularly, it's interesting because you see sort of the passing of a generation or an era. You see the old guard, leaving, people like Wendt, people working in that style. You see them exhibiting less and less, and you see more exhibitions, including this kind of material. Okay, Amy, let's go to Turner. Oh, sorry, I'm sorry. Hold on. Sorry. Thank you. And I lost my notes for this. So this is about 1942. This is another example of painting the California scene. And it was really about painting things as they were. It wasn't about idealism or romanticism. Like if you think back to the earlier picture we saw of Ironing Day by Jean Mannheim, that type of scene at this point in time was virtually non-existent. These painters are wanting to paint things that are more gritty, more realistic, more having to do with sort of what you might call the realities of the street, sort of that type might have been considered worthy of being painted a decade prior. Go ahead and go. I think there might be one more, Amy. Yes, so here we are. This is 1972. This is Roland Peterson. And this is, Roland Peterson is a main figure in the Bay Area figurative movement. So in the 1950s, especially in San Francisco, you had this big movement of purely abstract painting. And interestingly enough, a lot of the painters that came to San Francisco to study and learn how to paint in a purely abstract mode were there on the GI Bill, because the GI Bill allowed for that. So the art schools are filling up with men who'd come out of the service and wanted to do something on the GI Bill, but it was purely abstract. And of course, with any movement, there ends up often being a reaction against the movement. So what you see here, with the advent of the Bay Area figurative painters, 50s, 60s and beyond, they're really reacting against the idea of pure abstract expressionism. So they want to bring back the figure. They want to bring back representation. When you're looking at a tree, they want you to know that clearly that's what you're seeing, or a table or a landscape. So they've harkened back to representational painting, and it's abstracted, but they're walking that line. They're combining both. They're taking some elements of abstraction and some elements of representation and combining them. And this artist, Roland Peterson, I'm very happy to say, is 94, and he's still painting today. There you go. So and I believe that concludes, yes, that concludes the overview.